Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Eat. It is 6 o'clock in the morning, so we are getting getting right to it. I started talking and I was thinking, wow, I haven't talked yet today because why would I have talked? But then I realized I did have a full conversation with Tallow before, so yeah, I have been talking, but it is still very much the morning. I have with me my usual lineup, my filtered water with lemon and real salt and a latte. And we are diving into part two of holistic health for dogs. Now, I was overambitious with the last episode to think that I could successfully condense 400 pages into an hour. And I failed at that miserably. So we are diving into part two, where I'm just going to continue sharing from the book, The Forever Dog, and providing my insights, my thoughts, how I feel about certain things throughout the episode. But I'm hopeful that you're able to take away a whole lot. It has been a lot of fun with Tallow applying some of these strategies and just taking them more into consideration. And as she gets older, exploring more of what I can do and how I can support her and finding a routine. And whether that be with supplements or her food or her lifestyle, as far as walks go or whatever the case is. And I'm looking forward to being able to share that all with you. And then obviously through the book that I've read and now I'm sharing on the podcast, I'm hopeful that you are able to take away some inspiration for your furry friend as well. That is the goal here. If you are listening to this episode the week of its release, I am drowning probably right now in the very best way with free lab consults. And I am so excited that this is the first official week that I have individuals on my calendar to discuss testing and to get that ball rolling. So I am excited to announce that exclusively for podcast listeners, I am offering a discount through the month of July for testing. This is the first time I have shared on it, that I've talked about it. You'll hear it in upcoming episodes. But if you mention the podcast on our consult, you will get $150 off of the program. So that is valid through the month of July. You have to schedule within the month of July in order to get access to it. But I have been so obnoxiously talking about functional lab testing on the podcast. Maybe you're enjoying it. I don't know. And also I've been sharing episodes and I'm planning on, spoiler alert, um recording a series through the month of July all about labs and specifics of gut health and liver health and hormone health and really educating as much as I can on these concepts. So not only can you learn about it, but you can also expand your understanding of what we'll be looking at if you do decide to pursue testing. And then even further, I can refer individuals to the podcast in order to listen to these episodes to give them, say 3, 4, 5 hours of essentially educating them on these concepts. And so that they have a really robust foundation to stand on, when they decide to embark into testing. So this I'm excited for. I think there's so much to be discussed. So I'm brainstorming I'm brainstorming topics now, and that will be throughout the month of July, and I am very, very excited for that. And so, once again, if you mention that you were sent from the podcast, you will receive $150 off of the program. So please feel free to take advantage of that discount. And as always, if you have questions for me, please let me know. So I'm sitting here recording this episode, and I was so close to being able to have Tallow out and about and around and close to me while doing that. But my girl just gets herself into each and everything. Now, my home is a mess right now. I feel like I am just all over the place. And this week, I'm trying to like chip away at cleaning. But this weekend I was away, and then next weekend I'm bartending a couple private events, which is not something I do very often, but just happened to be the same weekend. I'm doing quite a bit. And I have to be down the shore. There's we are getting after it, okay? In both social life and professional life and all the things, which is great. Don't get me wrong, this is all great. However, it does leave some of the basic needs of life, including cleaning, on the back burner for a minute. I'm going to focus on that today, but I couldn't let her roam out and about because she just gets herself into every single thing and then I can't focus and it's just no good. So one day, I look forward to the day that she can just be out and either playing or sleeping or whatever the case is, and I don't have to worry about it, but she's now in her crate and I hear her little whimpers and it is so sad, but it is what it is, right? We gotta do what you gotta do. So, without further ado, let's get into part 2 of Foundations for Holistic Health for Dogs. Welcome to Let's Eat. I'm your host, Emily, certified holistic health coach, functional nutrition expert, and self-proclaimed wellness enthusiast, here to meet you at the intersection of physical and mental health, the space within which we become well. This podcast is meant to explore all areas of mind and body wellness, designed to offer you the integrative knowledge, behavioral strategies, and mindset shifts necessary to uplevel your health and feel better today. We'll explore nutrition, sleep, movement, self-care and stress management, habits and routines, self-development, gut health, mental health, and more. I am so happy that you're here. Welcome to the table. Let's eat. So I think we may have left off talking about the value of fasting. I truthfully don't remember, but I do know I briefly mentioned there are these pathways, these metabolic pathways that are important for healthy aging, either being activated or suppressed, and that fasting can be ways for us, both as humans and as dogs, in order to support them. And so I always find that interesting because I do have mixed feelings on fasting when it comes to humans, but when it comes to dogs, and understanding the fact that biologically speaking, they're really not meant to be fed all day long at all hours of the day. I mean, neither are humans. We're not meant to be grazing all day long. We are meant to have some boundaries where we are not eating and then when we are eating. And unfortunately, our culture has perpetuated and promoted this nonstop, perpetual, I'm just constantly eating, and it's not doing good essentially for our biology and our health and so forth. And same thing with dogs. So I do remember, I think I may have suggested this. The author suggests even going down to one meal a day when it comes to dogs, I believe. I was feeding tallow 3 times a day because the breeder was doing that, but I quickly transitioned her off of that. Now she's eating twice a day. And obviously, with training and so forth, she's eating treats throughout the day. And the treats are mostly just blueberries and beef liver. But I remember sharing, there'd be times where I would get home late, not planning to be home late, and I wouldn't have, fed Lou. And then I'd end up feeding her at like 8, 9 o'clock and feel like, oh my God, I feel so badly. I didn't feed her, which, yeah, of course, she's probably anticipating being fed. So she would like to be fed. But the author says, if you miss the meal, just miss the meal. It's almost better for them because it's this kind of, healthy stress, we'll call it. It's what we call a hormetic stressor. That's, time restricted eating, calorie restriction, fasting. That's considered a hormetic stressor. It's, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger type of vibe. And there's a lot of information that you can read up on when it comes to this. Mark Hyman talks about this quite a bit. But it's really interesting because in that moment I feel badly, but realistically, it's actually very supportive of her health. So I will probably maintain the 2 meals a day with tallow, but specifically with like cats, I know a lot of people just leave food down and the cat can come and go as they please. And maybe you have a dog that's like that. Tallow is definitely not that. Tallow is so hungry and food motivated and wants food all the time. She is insane. So if there was food on the ground, she would eat it. So I cannot just leave food out for her. However, if you have a dog or a cat that is just grazing throughout the day, the author recommends that you pick up the food and you don't leave it out. I may have covered this already, but I want to just be sure I mention that. So let's get into cancer. And obviously, this hits close to home. And not only with Lou, but I lost a couple other Goldens in my life to cancer. My childhood Golden, we got him when I was 10, maybe, and he died when I was 21. And he dealt with cancer his whole life. He was diagnosed at 4, then he was diagnosed again at 8, and then he eventually passed away at 11. And that was obviously very hard because he had been such a huge part of my life growing up. And then we lost Bella. She was, I forget how old she was, but she lived with my mom after my mom moved. And we lost Sage, I believe, our first Golden to cancer. So there's been quite, he was 14, I believe, 13 or 14, but he was a part of my life, my whole life. I was born into my family, and he was in my family. So, many Goldens over the course of my 30 years of life, and then obviously losing Lou back in February. So, approximately 1 in 3 dogs will be diagnosed with cancer during its lifetime. Half of the dogs over 10 years of age die from or with it. And, cancer is obviously very complex, both in humans and in dogs. Now, the author focuses a lot on the genetic aspect of it and what essentially takes place when there's mutations that take place. But, there's also a consideration to be made around what we can do. She's referring to the metabolic theory of cancer. So she says, the metabolic theory of cancer entertains the idea that there are things we can do to influence the health and well being of our mitochondria, which can influence our cancer risk and, if needed, cancer treatment. Which actually, speaking of this, MindBodyGreen just released a post yesterday, posted something yesterday about how exercise bolsters cancer treatment. I forget exactly the statistics. I would have to pull it up. Well, actually, hold that thought. Let me pull it up because I don't want to just misquote this. Okay. First ever clinical trial proves it. Exercise can beat cancer recurrence better than many drugs. Researchers found that those who followed a structured exercise program after chemo had a 28% lower risk of recurrence and 37% lower risk of dying compared to those who only received general health education. That's just as powerful as currently approved drug treatments. This wasn't intense marathon training, which honestly, I would even in response to that, I would say probably not, because that's probably more stress on the body, in intense stress, and the body's already undergoing so much stress. So that would probably not be good. But anyways, participants aimed for the equivalent of 3 to 4 sessions of brisk walking, 45 to 60 minutes each per week. That's insane. This needs to be broadcasted everywhere. But anyways, I do believe that there is value in us supporting our metabolic health, our mitochondria, which are the powerhouse of the cell, and being able to mitigate our risk and prioritize prevention through lifestyle. And dogs, I personally believe, are no different. What's interesting is she doesn't speak too far into cancer at this point in the book, but what I wanted to point out is, the difference when it comes to dogs and cancer is typically the cancer is much further progressed in dogs because of the fact not only do we age or dogs age quicker than humans, but also it isn't detected for some time, typically, we'll say, I don't want to say all cases, because dogs aren't able to communicate with us that they don't feel well. So when it comes to humans, we notice when we don't feel well. We notice when we feel off, when something's not right, and we seek out support and guidance and testing in order to clarify. But in this case with dogs, it's just a different ball game because they're not able to say, "Oh yeah, I just don't feel right." And I think that was the case with Lou for me. I she had outward symptoms with skin issues and you know without getting too far into that, one the vet I was seeing, she kind of wrote it off to allergies and kind of dismissed it. And I took that because I thought, well, the vet knows what she's talking about. They know what they're looking at. But I don't think I noticed a shift in Lou and her behavior until the last few weeks. And so it's interesting because I didn't notice any difference in her. And it was really just the outward presentation of what was going on her skin. But I had no way of knowing that she probably wasn't feeling well because there wasn't any way for me to ask her or talk to her about it or know. So it's just interesting, and that's not meant to put anyone, into a space of like panic of being hyper fixated on any abnormality. I feel like I do feel that a little bit with Tallow now. Just obviously she's a baby, but I may have shared this on one of the other episodes, but I think I may have. But, when I first started feeding her, I had this kind of like anxiety around it because Lou, the last few weeks, I just wanted her to eat so badly. I just wanted her to eat so badly, and she wasn't that last week. And so even now, like putting food down for Tallow, like this girl has no trouble eating, but there's that part of me that gets all because Lou, same way, like she used to love to eat. So putting that food bowl down and feeling that kind of like, oh, please just eat, because that's how I felt with Lou, and she just wasn't eating. And I know obviously Tallow does eat and will eat and had no trouble eating, but I'm kind of like in that trauma space of remembering how I would prepare her meal and, feel so like, okay, like she's gonna want to eat this, and then she wouldn't eat it. And that just like, ugh, just guts me. So I don't know where I I don't know where did I get here from? I don't oh, just dogs not acting differently and knowing kind of those telltale signs when they are starting to act differently or stop eating. That's usually a sign that things have gotten too far. And you can obviously, do your best to address it, but typically it's too far progressed at that point if those are the signs that you're seeing. So, one thing that I don't think is talked about enough, and I'm going to get into it with what the author has to say, is emotional and mental health of dogs. And she even says we can't overstate the third bucket, which she's referring to emotional mental health, because it's often downplayed or ignored. She says, we all know that unrelenting stress is toxic. And I would say, do we all know that? Because I'm pretty sure most people don't. But toxic to our health. But what about a dog's stress level? No joke. A Finnish study shows 72.5% of dogs display at least one form of anxiety, among other psychiatric issues we often attribute to humans, such as compulsive behaviors, fears and phobias, and aggressions. Studies of dogs who suffer psychological injuries or were poorly socialized early in life, for instance, point to serious long term effects in their health and longevity. Once again, such studies mimic those done on humans. Trauma and fear are crippling to our long term well being. This is a silent but deadly problem. Millions of these dogs end up in shelters every year, euthanized for behavior problems that were prompted by unmanaged experiences and events early in dogs' life and exacerbated by inappropriate and oftentimes abusive corrective training measures. Ultimately, unaddressed emotional trauma robs us and our companions of a vigorous, joyous life. So then she continues on to talk about how a lot of dogs are given psychiatric meds and that these are for anxiety, calming, or mood purposes. This translates to millions of animals in the United States taking medications for behavioral issues. A 2019 UK survey of dog owners revealed 76% of people wanted to change one or more of their dog's behaviors. The Finnish study we just highlighted found that noise sensitivity is the most common anxiety related trait, with a prevalence of 32% in 23,700 dogs. Some versions of human medications have received approval by the FDA for specific mental health uses in pets, including the antidepressant. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, for separation anxiety in dogs, and the sedative, also not going to try to pronounce that, for dogs with noise aversion problems. Most frustratingly, behavior altering drugs don't produce a dog with a brand new calm and balanced disposition. Behavior modifying drugs don't give your dog a new personality. You are still left coordinating and executing behavioral interventions that help manage your dog's stress response. Sadly, the truth is that many of these dogs lack proper mental and environmental stimulation, fear free, relationship centered training, and social connection. This is an ethical quagmire, particularly given the fact that we're talking about the patients who cannot speak their minds in our language, whose behaviors are often misinterpreted, and who are required to learn a foreign language to know what we expect of them. Oh my God, that sentence. Particularly given the fact that we're talking about patients who cannot speak their minds in our language, whose behaviors are often misinterpreted, and who are required to learn a foreign language to know what we expect of them. Oh my goodness. This is so true, right? That we are trying to speak to these dogs who don't understand our language. Their behaviors are oftentimes misinterpreted, and they're not able to speak up for themselves. And I know this is getting a little out there, right? But it's true. And it's such a shame because it's a lot of upbringing, and in some cases we can't control it, but if we are if we are raising a dog, so in my case with Tallow, the the responsibility and the impact that we can have when it comes to their development to avoid them being exposed to any kind of trauma, that is the same as not wanting to expose your child to trauma and have those early childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences that have profound influence on our physical and our mental health later on in life. The author also states that dog trainers and behaviorists would agree that many of the behavior problems that are found in dogs today are a direct result of poorly or inadequately socialized puppies growing up in homes with inadequate exercise, ineffective two-way communication, for example, learning to understand your dog, and insufficient dog chosen hobbies or interests. She refers to these as dog jobs, which I believe she goes into later on. So she quotes a renowned puppy trainer, Suzanne Clothier. She says, "The formative experiences that impact us the most throughout our lives are those that occurred when we were young and impressionable." It's the same for dogs. What did I just say? The research behind adverse childhood experiences blows my mind. And for those of you who don't know what that is, there's a woman named Nadine Burke Harris. She wrote the book The Deepest Well. Highly recommend if you are a parent, if you are in any kind of education setting with children, if you work with children in any way, or just if you have interests. I personally read it because of being in the mental health field. But basically, she dug into the research, into the world of understanding what type of impact having an adverse childhood experience has on development. Now, you can otherwise refer to this as trauma, okay, and whatnot, but we in the mental health world and more clinically refer to it as an ACE, ACE, adverse childhood experience. And there's a quiz that you can take. It's about, I forgot how many ACEs there are. I think there's probably 12 or 15. And it's questions like, I grew up in a household with an alcoholic parent. I grew up in a household with a convicted felon. I grew up in a household with, you know, divorced parents, or I grew up in a space of domestic abuse, or right. And so you you check off all the things that apply. And what they found is the higher the ACE score, the greater the correlation with later physical and emotional health problems. That's just a general statement. I'm sure there's more specific. So if you score 3 or more on the ACE test, you are at a greater likelihood for X, Y, and Z. If you score 5 or more, that doubles your risk of autoimmune or whatever the case is. And super, super interesting. Highly recommend. Once again, the book is The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris. And so, similarly, this is no different with dogs. And I think it's even a greater issue, and yet it's a less understood issue, at least to my understanding. So I just think it's an important perspective to take and to think about how much of an influence we do have on the social emotional development alongside the physical piece, because we know we are one whole body. Our physical health is our mental health, and our mental health is our physical health. And being patient with the process and acknowledging how formative those years are in their early life in order for them to become healthy, stable dogs and companions, and what kind of influence we have there. Adverse childhood experiences are no joke, and unfortunately, when it comes to children, they don't have the control. And I don't want to say that, as adults, that trauma that happens to individuals as adults, you know, they choose that or they control that, because that is absolutely not the case. And I know for me personally, I did not choose any kind of traumas that I experienced in my life as an adult or as a young adult. Certainly did not choose them. But as children, it's the brain development piece that makes them more vulnerable to lifelong impact. And not to say that trauma in adulthood can also impact them and can also impact our brain, but given the fact that children are so impressionable and so impacted in those moments during the critical times of development, it's the same thing with puppies. There's going to be more of an impact on them because as children, they're growing and their brains are developing and their view of the world is shaping, and it's important for us to remember the kind of nature versus nurture argument. And I could go on about this forever. So something to keep in mind if you are currently raising a puppy, if you have a young dog, if you're thinking about getting a puppy, there's a lot more responsibility involved there when it comes to their development in that regard that I don't think is always considered. So let's dive into a little bit more nutrition for dogs. I am really interested in this, of course, you can imagine, and it's been a lot of fun to incorporate new foods into Talo's diet. But what the author emphasizes here is dogs have been carnivores for all of existence. And according to the author, they have an ultra short gastrointestinal tract. They are unable to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight, and that's super fascinating. And they lack salivary amylase, which is the enzyme that digests carbs. Now, because domestic dogs have increased their pancreatic secretion of amylase, many veterinarians assume that dogs can be vegan, and the author disagrees. So she further states a calorie is not a calorie, according to diet and obesity researcher Dr. Jason Fung, who has written extensively on the power of time restricted feeding and the difference between a calorie from, say, a stack of syrupy pancakes versus a calorie from a veggie omelet. His insights, now widely accepted in the human nutrition community, fly in the face of almost every recommendation of today's board certified veterinarian nutritionists. Metabolically, a diet of all carbs, which is very much the case for most processed dog foods, act completely differently than a diet composed of balanced protein and healthy fats, and not all carbs are created equal. This should be no surprise to you. I've said this many times. How your body responds to a carb-rich meal depends on your chemical makeup and whether you digest those carbs quickly or slowly. An individual digesting a bowl of slow releasing carbs, like grilled veggies, will feel different from someone digesting a bowl of fast releasing carbs, like cereal. Those slow releasing carbs will help you feel full longer than the ones that rapidly get digested and keep you craving more and more. One thing all vets agree on is that healthy dogs, unlike cats, are evolutionarily adapted for starvation. Dogs were not all that successful at hunting at dawn and dusk every day. They could go for days without catching any food, which speaks to what I mentioned before about the fasting, and would eat what they would find vegetation, acorns, berries if they were unsuccessful in hunting for a fresh dinner. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, we know that traditional veterinarian medicine is much like our healthcare, where there's very little teaching and learning about preventing disease in the first place. It's more about disease management and controlling symptoms. And the author further states your vet isn't purposely withholding the critically important information. Rather, she doesn't discuss targeted nutritional interventions, lifestyle choices, and risk and preventative strategies because they didn't teach this to her in vet school. And then the author continues, and this, as I said before, which I think is a critical point to bring up again, the nutritional education that veterinary students do receive, much as with medical students, may be biased because courses are commonly taught by nutritionists endowed by commercial pet food conglomerates. Vets get their information largely from within the processed pet food industrial complex, the manufacturers of the very foods that contribute to poor animal health. So, really important to be aware of this, that a lot of the endorsements are coming from a incentive or coming from this is the education that I got to recommend these types of foods, so that's why I'm recommending them. You can only know what you know. So it makes sense as to why there's a limited, you know, there's limited information here from our vets around whole food nutrition and so forth, and any endorsement that is being recommended is based on what they were taught in school or the larger pet food companies that have their interest in their interest in mind, because we know that there's partnerships and funding and all of that. And so that's going to then incentivize and motivate and require these veterinarians to endorse the product because of that. And speaking of, five massive companies dominate the $80 billion ultra processed food industry for pets, and none of them currently produce a fresh pet food made with quality human grade ingredients. Mars Pet Care, which clinches the number one spot by a long shot, now includes three of the top five pet food brands in the world: Pedigree, Whiskas, and Royal Canine. The behemoth is a growing segment of approximately 50 brands. The more profits these companies lose to the myriad human grade fresh pet food companies popping up in the droves, which she mentioned before. I think that 87% of individuals are adding food to their ultra processed food diets for their dogs. So she said that 13% of individuals are exclusively feeding their dogs ultra processed pet food kibble. So that means 87% are supplementing with something else. And that's likely because there is this awakening taking place, which I do believe is also happening within the human space, of people are recognizing, okay, this is not going to cut it. Like there needs to be more. So, and even like I said in the last episode, she really endorses, even if you have to stick with the kibble, there's so much that you can still add to the kibble to make it more nutrient dense, make it more balanced. And so that's what she recommends, because it is time consuming, it is costly, but she doesn't want you to feel like it has to be this overhaul of your dog and their diet, and you're spending all this money and prepping all this food, but instead you are adding to what you're already giving to them to make it a little bit better. I also think too that there can be really irresponsible ways of going about this, and you really have to understand what your dog's needs are, what you should be offering them. It can't just be this kind of, impulsive, just throwing whatever on a plate and calling it a day, because definitely, there can definitely be adverse reactions, life-threatening reactions to it. And so you definitely want to be aware of that. But I think these veterinarians, and at least from what I'm kind of gathering here, from what I recall, they have a bad taste in their mouth about that, right? They're fearful about owners going out and overdoing it or doing it incorrectly and having these issues, and maybe they have experiences of pet owners who have lost pets because of that, and they're you know almost they're almost now so much more they're more hesitant to be supportive of people who are choosing this route. Now, I think there's a couple different influences here. If somebody's not educated in, say, nutrition for pets, and a pet owner comes in and asks about it, and the vet is not in a space, it's outside of their scope, they haven't been educated on it, and whatnot, then of course they're going to be a little bit more hesitant and reluctant to giving guidance or endorsing it. Secondly, if all they know is endorsing the pet brands that they've been educated on and they get kickbacks for endorsing the product or whatever the case is, that might keep them from being enthusiastic about someone coming in and saying, "Oh, I want to feed my dog X, Y, and Z," and feed them real whole foods. Maybe, like I said before, they've had an experience where something negative took something negative took place, and they don't want to be held accountable to it, or they don't want to be held responsible rather for it. So they quickly kind of shoot down someone's desire to support their dog with real whole foods. I think there's a number of reasons why vets are not supportive of this approach. And I can, to some extent, understand. But I think that then pet owners are taking that reluctance and that hesitation and that, you know, resistance to it as I'm not supposed to feed my dog anything that's real whole, or that I should be afraid to do that, or I should just stick with the kibble because the vet doesn't recommend it, and they're missing out on these opportunities. I think too, like I had said in the last episode, there's only a handful of foods that dogs really should not be eating. Chocolate, grapes, the author says macadamia nuts, and garlic and onion. And everything else, within reason and within moderation, can be added to your dog's plate. I am literally giving Tallow so much. Obviously, she's a puppy. Her stomach is probably not as, you know, um, we'll call it sturdy as maybe a full grown dog. So I'm keeping all of that in mind, but I'm still giving her food and exposing her to different types of fiber and different types of nutrition because that's what we do as humans. We do that as humans. We need lots of fiber, lots of different types of plants foods, lots of different types of animal foods, all providing the body with a different type of nutrition. So that is exactly what I'm doing for her. Now, I'm also doing that alongside a kibble, a high quality kibble. I still haven't decided what I'm going to do next as far as what she'll be eating as she grows up. I do like this routine that I have with it because I believe in the product, but that I know is her foundation where she's getting what she needs in a balanced way, and then I'm just amplifying her diet through the additional foods that I'm adding. But if we continue to turn to our vets, and not to say that you shouldn't because they are professionals and this is what they're trained in. If we're relying on their guidance for nutrition, we're probably not going to get the information that we want, or we're going to be redirected to going back to kibble or dry food or whatever the case is because of the fact that it's just not in their training, and they obviously don't want to misguide you and give you guidance around something that they just don't have knowledge around or education around. So there are different categories within which dog food exist. Okay, so there's ultra processed food, which are food like substances. Okay, then there's processed foods, so that's minimally processed. It probably has a couple different steps in terms of whether it's being heated or, I don't know, processed is obviously the word. It's not as raw or fresh as maybe some other food might be. And then there's unprocessed or raw or fresh flash processed foods. I'm going to focus on some of that This includes fresh raw ingredients that are slightly altered for the purpose of preservation with minimal nutrient loss. Examples of minimal processing techniques are grinding, refrigerating, fermenting, freezing, dehydrating, vacuum packaging, and pasteurizing of food. So, ideally, we want to focus on flash processed pet food as much as we can. The author explains fresher flash. This is try saying fresher flash processed. Try saying that 10 times and let me know because I'm about to trip over this like every single time I say it. Fresher flash processed dog food contains ingredients that have undergone one adulteration. This includes raw or frozen dog food diets, high pressure pasteurized raw dog food diets, freeze dried and dehydrated dog foods made from raw, previously unprocessed ingredients. They're called flash process because the adulteration or processing insult happens in a flash, a very short period of time, and only once. In theory, this category of pet food could be called ultra unprocessed, as it's on the opposite end of the processing spectrum as compared to ultra processed pet food. Processed dog food has undergone an additional thermal or heat adulteration step or contains ingredients that did. Now, when we're looking at ultra processed food, this is no different than what we see with human food. We are completely eradicating the nutritional value and decreasing the nutritional value in food when we continue to heat it, reprocess it, repackage it, right? And so think about all these steps in the process. If we continue to, it's kind of like, all right, I have a glass of lemonade. And the more that I add water to it, the less lemonade there's going to be in there. Because as you continue to add water to your glass, you're thinning out the lemonade to a point where it's not even going to taste like lemonade. And it's kind of, I don't know if that's a good example, but that's what came to mind, where you're just constantly processing it in order for it to be, mass packaged and mass produced, and it needs to be sitting on shelves for long periods of time. And so in order for you to do that, you can't have something that's going to go bad or, that's going to become inedible, right? You have to get it to a point where it could sit on the shelf for days and weeks on end and it will be okay. So, like I said, processed dog food has undergone an additional thermal adulteration step or contains ingredients that did. This category includes gently cooked dog food diets and freeze dried or dehydrated diets made with ingredients that were previously processed, not raw. This category of food is healthier than ultra processed pet foods because the ingredients have been refined or heated repeatedly. Now, buckle up. Listen to this. Ultra processed dog food has multiple heat adulterations. All right, so we're pouring lots of water in that lemonade. Includes previously heat refined ingredients and also contains industrial additives not available to the consumer. For example, we can't buy high fructose corn syrup or chicken meal or any meat meal in the grocery store. Only the food industry, human and pet respectively, has access to these ingredients. Now, listen to this. Corn gluten meal, a common ingredient in many veterinary lines of pet food, is available to consumers only as a weed killer sold in home and garden stores, not in grocery stores. And there's no home version of a kibble maker. By definition, ultra processed dog food include most air dried dry dog diets and some dehydrated dog diets that are not made from fresh and raw ingredients, and all canned, baked, and extruded dry dog foods. So basically, what I'm trying to share here is there's a spectrum, and finding a place that feels comfortable for you in terms of the quality of what you're giving your dog is what's most important, but also understanding that on one side of the spectrum, we have raw food, which is very much what dogs for decades, centuries, and hundreds of thousands of years have eaten. Now, raw is not always accessible. It's not always plausible. It's more expensive. So that's understood. But then if you make your way across that spectrum, there are tons of other options that, are better than the ultra processed, right? So you can find a space in the midst of that that feels comfortable for you, that feels plausible, that feels sustainable for you. But I just want to be sure that that is something to keep an awareness around, that the nutrition is so compromised when we start to move closer to the opposite end of the spectrum. And that is something to be cautious of. Now, there's something that the author calls core longevity toppers, CLTs. And this is what she speaks to, adding in these CLTs to your dog's meal to optimally increase the dog's nutrition. So even if you have to choose that ultra processed food for your dog, you can add in some of these toppers, which I've just scratched the surface with. I have to sit down with the recipes that I've been looking at and start to get creative and share on them, but there are lots of ways for you to amplify your dog's nutrition through these core longevity toppers so that you can make them a little bit more robust and include a little bit more nourishment in their day to day. So, as I mentioned before, what's interesting is dogs can produce more amylase now. It's the enzyme that breaks down carbs. And in the past, that wasn't the case, but this is like an evolutionary progression. And according to the author, Dr. Richard Patton says even 150 years ago, a dog's overall carb consumption was estimated to be less than 10% of their caloric intake, completely manageable for a dog's active lifestyle because carbs are broken down quickly into glucose, and that's a source of energy. It's the body's preferred source of energy. In the last 100 years, since the invention of carb rich, ultra processed dog food, a dog's involuntary carb intake, involuntary, because it doesn't choose to eat this, right? This is based on their owners, has skyrocketed, which hasn't served his metabolic machinery well. Dogs can and do digest carbs, but that's not the issue. Like in humans, dogs' consumption of a diet of refined carbs over the long term will bear adverse health consequences. Now, this is no different than the metabolic crisis that we see in our country and the presence of high blood sugar and insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes and all of these issues that stem from that due to a highly refined carb based diet. Although a dog's pancreas produces enzymes that can break down carbs, that doesn't mean the bulk of a dog's calories should come from starch. It's a setup for health challenges, particularly metabolic ones that lead to systemic inflammation and obesity. Banfield Pet Hospital, which operates numerous veterinary clinics in the United States, Mexico, and the UK, is owned by Mars Incorporated, reports that obesity is up 150% in dogs over the last decade alone. Holy cow. So, what's important is focusing on avoiding overdoing it on the carbs and focusing on fat and protein and even fiber first and keeping carbs at a minimum. Now, you can look at the back of your dog food, and this is all outlined. I'll share a little bit more about how to kind of interpret that. But this is why many fresh food formulators say roughly 50% of calories, not volume of food, should come from protein and 50% from fat. This is the ancestral diet that domesticated and wild canines prefer and need. So, if you look at your bag of kibble, find the guaranteed analysis, then add up protein, fat, fiber, moisture, and ash. Estimate 6% if you don't see a value for ash, the estimate of the mineral content of food, and subtract your result from 100. Let me say that again. Add up protein, fat, fiber, moisture, and ash, and estimate 6% if you don't see a value for ash, the estimate of the mineral content of food, and subtract your result from 100. This is the amount of starch in your dog's food. Because the indigestible fiber is included in this calculation, the number you are left with is the amount of starchy carbs that break down into sugar in your dog food. A biologically appropriate amount is less than 10%. She states, I have found that many active dogs can tolerate up to 20% starch or sugar in their diet without significant consequences, but feeding a lifetime of 30 to 60% starch when none is required will have unintended consequences. As I mentioned, humans who eat mostly carbs that are made of refined flours and sugar struggle with inflammation and health issues. And this is no different for dogs. And it's so important that we're aware of the fact that most foods are predominantly these high carb, high starch foods, not only because it's cheaper, but they're also likely more shelf stable as a result, and they're not getting enough of the high quality fat and protein that they are biologically wired to desire and to thrive on. So, keeping that in mind as you prepare your dog's meals and what you add to it and the way you vet out your brands, super important. Now, it's also important to share that dogs eating dry food or kibble tend to have higher inflammation and obesity rates than those eating fresh dog food. I don't think that that's a very surprising statement to make, but we also know that chronic low grade inflammation is what's going to be the beginning of disease. So if we're routinely feeding a non-diverse carb and starch heavy diet with minimal nutrition to our dogs, and we're expecting our dogs to thrive on that, that is not the case. So let me give you some rapid fire facts on more pet food and pet food approaches and things that are not regulated and all that good stuff. So realistically, pet food should be called pet feed because it's made with ingredients not approved for human consumption. Pet food companies use all feed grade ingredients unless the brand specifically states human grade on the website. Our estimate is that less than 1% of canned and dry pet food is made with human grade ingredients, which speaks volumes about the quality and level of possible contaminants in the vast majority of pet foods. Dog and cat nutrient requirements are issued by the AAFCO, which I mentioned in the last episode, Association of American Feed Control Officials. Companies are supposed to follow their guidelines in order to label their products nutritionally complete and balanced. AAFCO requires that pet food labels include a guaranteed analysis, as I mentioned before, a statement of nutritional adequacy, and list of ingredients in descending order by weight. Significantly, however, the organization does not require digestibility testing or finished product nutrient testing. I think I mentioned that in the last episode. The best buy or expiration date on the bag is for an unopened bag of food. Companies do not disclose how long the food is stable or safe to feed once the bag is opened. Pet food companies are not required to specify on the ingredient label any chemical preservatives or other substances added to the bulk ingredients they purchase from their suppliers. There are no laws or regulations regarding or requiring pet food companies to screen their products for heavy metals, pesticide or herbicide residues, or other contaminants. And this is this is the reality. I just I I'm not surprised, but I'm also surprised, but I'm not surprised. It just goes to show that there's just much less rigor, and I would even go as far as to say that the food industry for humans, there is no rigor in terms of quality and safety. And even further, the pet industry is clearly right up there, if not more concerning. Now, I want to also share that dogs have glyphosate levels 32 times the human average, which is insane. So, not only is this disrupting their gut microbiomes, it's also placing extreme burden on their liver and their ability to detox, but they also never make dogs feel full, which is so fascinating. Fresh feeding vets have noted many dogs on kibble appear to be ravenous, bottomless pits, never satiated and always hungry, which raises the question, are they desperately trying to meet their biologic requirements for fat and protein by gorging on their carb rich sole source of calories? For sure. If you're not eating protein, fat, and fiber, you aren't going to feel full. This is a PSA for anyone out there. That's just the way it goes. So if dogs, too, are consuming mostly carbs, it is to no surprise that they will not feel full. They're going to feel ravenous. They're going to want to eat more. And being exposed to toxins, and if they're finding that they are exponentially more ridden with glyphosate, that will pose a ton of health risks. Now, speaking of the microbiome, we know we have a microbiome, we have many microbiomes, and it's so important for nutrient absorption, for production of hormones, for obviously digestion. The list goes on. There's so many roles that the gut plays within the body, and like I said, the dogs have microbiomes as well, and our food choices and exposure to chemicals and lifestyle, artificial sugars, antibiotics, all of the things, even emotional stress and trauma, all of which have influence on the gut. So given what we learned in the last episode, and then given what we're learning in this episode about how we're taking care of our dogs, you can imagine that our microbiomes or our dogs' microbiomes rather, are very disrupted. And not only that, the bulk of our immune system resides in our gut. It's called the gut associated lymphatic tissue, otherwise known as the GALT. And nearly 70% of our total immune system is in the gut. And so the more that we can also take care of our dog's gut, I mean, most humans are not taking care of their own guts, but maybe they'll be willing to take care of their dog's guts. So important. And this is going to come from real whole foods, getting quality exercise, getting circadian rhythm support, which I don't think we talked about. We'll talk about in later episodes. But focusing on fostering a healthy microbiome is essential, and eliminating toxins and reducing stress and focusing, like I said before, on avoiding that emotional trauma. Super, super, super important. So I'm going to talk more about the microbiome in a later episode so I can really go into more depth about it, but I want to just rattle off some more of these marketing ploys or marketing tactics or the holes in the system when it comes to the pet food industry to wrap up. So, premium is an undefined and unregulated term. Anything can be premium. Okay, so if your dog food says premium this, premium that, just ignore that because it has no meaning. Vet approved means any vet can endorse the food for any reason, including a paid endorsement. I mentioned that before. Organic, fresh, and natural can mean many things as it does in the human food industry. That's like greenwashing. Deceptive marketing is permissible with pet food products. Pictures of a perfectly roasted turkey on the bag doesn't mean the bag contains roasted turkey. Okay. The FDA's compliance policy allows pet food companies to use animals that have died otherwise by slaughter in pet food. Holy cow. I didn't read that sentence before I spoke it out loud. So that's horrifying. In theory, animals that die by slaughter are healthy until they are killed. But under the compliance policy, animals that die from disease or other causes may be rendered and those tissues used in pet food. This is how euthanasia solution ended up in pet food that killed many animals several years ago. Holy cow. Many brands have trademarked marketing lingo to make you feel good about what you're buying. Life Source Bits, Vitality Plus, and Proactive Health formulas, even though we have no idea what these terms mean. The amount of actual supplementation in foods that promote extra benefits, such as glucosamine for hip and joint health or added omega 3s for skin and coat health, can be parts per million. Literally homeopathic amounts of supplements to lure you with no added health benefits. And understand what Dr. Marion Nestle calls the salt divider. Companies know that superfoods look good on the label, but how do you know how much turmeric, parsley, or cranberries are actually in the food? Look to see where these foods are listed on the label. Do they appear before or after salt? Salt, a required mineral for pets, will almost never be more than 0.5 to 1% of ingredients. So, superfoods listed after salt are for marketing show. I feel like I probably could have just read those statements for today's episode, and that would have been enough to really drive my point home. And I want you to remember there's something called humane washing. I know in the food industry, I call it like a health halo or like greenwashing. And it's the use of common phrases are humane, happy, pasture raised, caring, no antibiotics ever, naturally raised. These are undefined by the USDA, so you can use them loosely. And a consumer is going to look at that and think positively of that brand. And obviously, we're kind of learning that there's nothing behind those words. It's really just a way for them to market their product as being more positive or more wholesome. And at the end of the day, it is no good. Now, I'll leave you with this. I keep saying this, but I'll leave you with this. The average bag of dry dog food, kibble, contains ingredients that have been fractionated or isolated, refined, and heated an average of 4 times, making it by definition ultra, 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 ultra processed. Okay. So that is where we will conclude for today's episode. I have so much left to say about this. And today's episode was mostly about nutrition. And that's great. And that's going to be the bulk of the episodes moving forward, just to empower you to incorporate more real whole foods into your dog's life, and maybe why vets are hesitant to recommend that. But just keeping an awareness around this topic. If you are a pet owner, if you're interested in it, I'm happy that you're here and bearing with me as we move through this book, because, like I said, we're chipping away at this conversation, and it's really just kind of like an open dialogue as I move through the book and pull out some of the information for you to chew on and to digest. And I hope that it brings you value, and maybe it'll shift the way you see the way you're raising your dog or taking care of your dog, and you can make small improvements to help to support their health better and hopefully prevent disease. So thank you for being here. I appreciate you. I hope you enjoyed. And until next time, be well.